Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it may be. Hi, my name is Geoff Huston. I am the chief scientist at APNIC, and I'm sorry I'm unable to actually make it over to South Africa for ZANOG today. Planes, budgets, ticket costs, blah, blah, blah. So it's virtual me doing this recording for you. I will try, though, to try and be online when this is replayed so that I will be around if you have any questions. So, what are we talking about today? You know, when you try and look at the internet, you got a problem. Because last I heard, the internet is really, really, really big. And it's very, very hard to coalesce all of those separate parts of the internet and get a grand view. Sure, you can measure the internet in your neck of the network. You could look at it from the perspective of your home, your workplace, your ISP, but that's just one perspective out of literally tens of thousands. How do you get a picture of everything? How do you get the entire internet? Well, interestingly enough, there's one tool that actually brings every last piece of the internet to you. And that, oddly enough, is the job of the routing protocol, BGP. Because if you run BGP, then everyone who is advertising routes all over the net, the job of BGP is to bring all of that to you. And by looking at BGP, oddly enough, you get a picture of all of the internet all of the time. And this actually gives us, I think, some real insights into what is happening on the internet today, and even some indications as to why it might be happening this way. So let's dive in and have a look at BGP, and in particular, let's look at the last 12 months, BGP in 2023. So the highlights, look, I'll go through V4, V6, some projections on the routing space, the fib, churn, and conclusions. So this is 30 years of the internet, all pulled together in one magnificent slide. It actually combines not only my view of BGP in my neck of the woods, one view, but I combine it with another, these days, close to 650 views from both Route Views, University of Oregon, and from RIPE's Routing Information Service. And I pull up all of their views and all of their peers, all of them. And so, in amongst other things, which led to V6, we also introduced a move away from the address plan of the internet up until then. Because up until around 1993, addresses only came in one of three sizes. A bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, really, if you're familiar with that one. You had a Class A, which, was just too big. There were very, very few networks out there that really matched the, 16.7 million host addresses that came in a Class A. And then there were Class Cs, to the other end of the address size, which had 256 addresses, host addresses. And although this was kind of okay for small networks for a while, as personal computers started to multiply, as they did, 256 in most sort of enterprise or university environments was just too little. And there was this strange kind of Class B in the middle, which was 64,000 addresses, 65,356 or something, who cares, 2 to the 16th, which was sort of better than a C and not so extravagant as an A. And so it became very popular. But at the same time, we were going to run out of all those Bs very, very quickly in 1992 with, oh my God, disaster. What do you do? Well, we did, oddly enough, the sensible thing. We got rid of classes. So instead of just those three address sizes, we said, well, why don't we just carry the size with the route object? So you could have a /24, a /23, a /22, whatever size you need that we can sort of squeeze into the address space. And this model of routing, and indeed of addressing, classless interdomain routing, kind of saved us. And the life we've been living since then has been all classless. So that was cider in 1994. And you can see by the small blip, the growth of the internet stopped for, at least 6 months. But it was back to its steady growth again. Some of you might remember the great internet boom and the subsequent bust around the year 2000, 2001, where, the internet had taken the world by storm. Not really. And although the bust lasted for all of about, 6 months, as you can see there, we were back on again. Because across the noughties, the ISP business changed hands and it moved from being small entrepreneurs with bunches of dial-ups into the telephone companies actually making a move and swinging the internet into their infrastructure. And all of a sudden, instead of an enthusiast market playing games, this was becoming mass market. Firstly, it was mass market using modems, which was always a pain. Remember them? Horrible. Any of you using them, stop it. We then moved to a permanent connection model using DSL, actually using that analog connection but ganging it up vertically. So instead of having a few kilobits per second, DSL could scale up from low megabits into sort of 10, 20, 30, if you were lucky, I guess, megabits per second with sort of high-speed DSL solutions. And across the noughties, we were deploying like crazy. By 2011, the central pool operated by the IANA ran dry. And we were in the midst of fueling this massive wave of internet. And oddly enough, you hardly even noticed that on the graph. The internet just kept on growing. And even as the registries themselves started to run out of addresses, the routing space just grew and grew and grew, which seems like a contradiction until you realize that what we were doing was slicing and dicing at ever finer levels. So that before you might get a /16, you might have cut that up into a few /18s, which themselves were sliced and diced into 23s and 24s. And it wasn't really until the last couple of years, I think, that you actually see in this graph that pace of growth has finally slackened off some 13 or so years after the first point of exhaustion, those central pools. So let's look at 2023 in particular, and this is the size of the routing table in V4 across those 12 months from every peer of recent route views. So each color thread is one peer. And the first thing you notice, which is kind of weird, is that almost nobody sees the same internet as anybody else. We don't really pay a huge amount of attention to actually all making sure we have the same view of the internet. And in addressing terms, the variations as big as around 18 million addresses between, the peer with the smallest view of default to the one with the most extravagant. Notice that big discontinuity there around late April, early March, where everyone sort of dropped some routes, except the low order, everybody. What was it? It was Turkey, where two ASs, 9121 and 47331, collectively dropped around 7,500 prefixes all of a sudden, really all of a sudden, just in March 2023. And oddly enough, it wasn't that Turkey was pulling out, TT was pulling out of the internet, not at all. But they withdrew more specifics. They were taking out of the network their traffic engineering prefixes and simply working off their aggregates. We'll return to that, I think, because it's kind of an interesting fact that normally BGP carries two roles, connectivity and traffic engineering. And if all of your content is a long, long way away, engineering that traffic to come across all of your available links, so you selectively advertise more specifics down some of your links, is something we've been doing for years. But Turkey has stopped. TTNet has stopped doing that. And you kind of go, why? And of course, the obvious answer is because all of their traffic is now coming from data centers inside Turkey. And so now there's no real need to perform that fine-grained traffic engineering because all the traffic is now localized not being imported from America, from Europe, from faraway places. So when we look at dropped prefixes, Turkey wasn't the only ones. There have been a number of networks, and the ones that I think I find interesting is the drop in SprintLink, CenturyLink, both of which are relatively large US providers, and China, and the ones that are growing, Amazon, yes, but the rest aren't really core. The big US networks are not actually growing in the amount of routes that they're advertising on the internet. So in some ways, it's an odd picture that there is some growth, but realistically, there's also some drops. So there's prefixes and there's addresses. And interestingly, if we look at the internet, the V4 internet, from the point of view of address span, how many addresses are actually covered in these advertisements, you get a completely different picture. Because now the great internet boom was a nothing. The consumer model across the noughties certainly was consuming a lot of addresses. We started a little over 1 billion addresses in 2000 or so, and we got to 2.5 billion addresses being advertised by 2012. But by the time we got to 2.5 billion addresses, and don't forget, there are really only 3 billion addresses in play, all of the last, 10 years, in fact, 12 years, has been in eking out those remaining addresses, those 500 million addresses or so. And although there's this sort of blip, which was the old /8s given to the Department of Defense, in the year dot, when Methuselah was a young man, the rest of it's actually a different picture. We have been cramming ourselves as the number of devices obviously grew from millions to billions. We did it with almost no additional addresses being advertised into the routing system. And now when we look at 2023 in detail, this is, I'd live to see this. And you start to think about what's happening in the internet. I mean, have we got to the point of the S word, saturation? Has everyone who's ever wanted a connection got one? Is there growth left? Hard to say, but there's more data around that actually suggests that yes, the internet is declining. This is taking a graph of the amount of addresses being allocated out of the regional address registries. And on the whole, across the year, nothing happened. There's not that much to give out. The unadvertised pool of addresses didn't shrink. It grew by about a /8. It's 18 million addresses. And the advertised pool, that's by the way, the Amazon blip, the advertised pool declined by that same amount. The internet, in V4 sense, from addressing, is actually getting smaller. We thought with address trading, moving addresses around, that this would actually flush out unadvertised addresses. They'd be able to make money by selling their unused addresses on the open market, and this would encourage more efficient use. But we've been wrong. In the longer term, and this is that same graph, but now with a midpoint, at the start point back in 2018, you see that the unadvertised pool has been inexorably growing. And the only thing that changed that step function was the US Department of Defense bringing some unadvertised addresses up and advertising them. If it wasn't for that, what we are seeing is, in fact, the advertised pool continues to shrink. SprintLink, wow, 6 million addresses disappeared. Lucent, another big provider, 2 million. AT&T Internet, one of the big three, down by 2 million. Even Google, which didn't have that many addresses advertised to start with, 10.2 million. But by the end of the year, it's down to 9 million. Even Comcast, the biggest retail provider in the US, down by 1.1 million. So oddly enough, the address span is coming down, not from the edges, but right from the core where the largest networks are. The US, those old unused /8s, yes, they all appeared on the network, thank you. And there's Amazon's contribution of 2 million addresses, thank you, Amazon. But there's not really a picture of massive growth. Not really. It's actually one of reduced. The growth of the entire size of the network is slowing down, and from the addressing perspective, it's declining like crazy. Only 1,100 new autonomous systems over the year. Previous year it was 1,400. So in some ways, everything is slowing down or even reversing. And it's a reasonable question to ask, have we reached peak V4? Is this as big as we need to get? Does everyone who need an internet connection have one? Are NATs so much part of the fabric that the growth in devices, and there is some growth in raw device count, is this all just being absorbed by NATs? Is V4, if you will, had its day? Are we now declining? And if so, and that's a fine thing to look at, the numbers are suggesting that, is it all about V6? Now, you look at the 20-year view of V6, and the data doesn't go back beyond 2004. The first look is, oh my God, that's where the growth is. It looks strongly exponential. You see that huge curve between 20 and 22 that, in the early years of COVID, things started to go a little bit crazy out there. And V6 was just hammering. It's slowed down a bit since then. And certainly by January 2024, though, what I do find sort of interesting is that same vertical diversity that we see in V4, not everyone has the same view, is now appearing in V6 as well. And so in 2023 across the year, there is some growth. This is 160,000 entries at the start of the year and closing the year somewhere between 180 and around 190, 200,000 entries in the V6 routing table. Why there's such a big difference between various BGP speakers out there, not sure. The upper band, I think, is Europe. The lower band is America. Still not sure why. Some step functions. Vietnam decided to, in one of their major service providers, advertise 3,000 new prefixes, and over in Hong Kong, another 2,000, for which we're very grateful. Thank you. But there is one thing, and you noticed in V4, the more specifics were coming down. I said that was a declining role of traffic engineering because content is shifting closer to the edge. You don't need traffic engineering. And that's a fine theory. But if you look at V6, the more specifics, which were originally back in 10 years ago, 30% of the routing table, is now hitting a phenomenal 60%, of which, these days, most of those more specifics are /48s. This is insane because there are so many /48s, 2 to the 48th of them, that if everyone did that, your routers would not handle it. They would melt. Why does everyone think that a /48 is the IPv6 equivalent of a /24? I don't know. But nevertheless, everyone advertises a whole hunk of them. 2/3 of the network is wasted in /48s. This is the contrasting view of addresses. So let's just go back a second. Massive growth. Because in addressing terms, what's being actually advertised is not huge growth. Now, it's always hard to find the right unit for V6. And so this isn't /128s, and it's not even /32s, or at least it is, but think of thousands of /32s, So we're rising from, 20,000 /32s being advertised, 20 years ago, up to around 160,000 /32s today. Again, quite some variation. Not everyone has the same reachability as everyone else, and nobody seems to care. As long as you've got your fix from YouTube, Netflix, and all the rest of the video streamers, who cares about talking to anyone else? And so ubiquitous connectivity is no longer an issue for this industry. No one minds, no one cares, no one fixes it. In 2003, the V6 network grew a little, a very small amount. So if you said, well, all the growth in V4 was moved into growth in V6, you'd probably be wrong. It grew by around 17%. It's predominantly /48s. The growth of /32s was very small. The address span just 1.6%. So it's not really growing. So let's now take all those numbers and make some projections from them. And this is again unique. This is the first time that the numbers say we've peaked in V4. Now, I don't know if that's, real, but this is the best fit of those numbers from the last 5 years gives you an order 2 polynomial where, in effect, we've reached the top. That it's just a little under a core arrangement of around a million odd networks. That's about it. The numbers suggest after that it starts to decline. Whether it's going to happen or not, yeah, different thing. But that's what the numbers are saying. V6 used to be exponential. It's now strongly linear. It's a long and steady growth. And, over the coming sort of 5 years, it might well hit 400,000 entries in the routing table, but it's pushing it. That linear growth model is very, very constrained. So it's growth, but not a lot. The underlying network, is more about /48s than anything else. So in absolute terms, because V6 is 4 times bigger than V4 in your routing tables, it's growing faster than V4, but the major issue is BGP will keep on going for some time. It's not under any major stress. The other thing, of course, is it's not the size, but it's the dynamic properties that really, really, really matter. And this is an odd graph. It has the size of the routing table, but now the number of updates I see in my network on the edge. And the first thing you notice is, although the size is growing, the data. If you look at a series of updates that are trying to find the new stable path, and you look at how long it takes for each update event to stabilize, back in 2014 or so, it was around 50 seconds, 2.75 MRI timers. These days, it's actually slightly lower at around 45 to getting even closer to 40 seconds. The network is actually performing better, even though it's much, much larger. That, again, is amazing and certainly unpredicted. So it's stable. Routing instability is now concentrated in a small number of pathologically bad cases, and the rest of the network is just stable. But that's V4. No one looks at V6. No one cares about V6. And it's probably evidenced by the fact that V6 is far less stable, far more unstable. If you look at the size of the routing table, and this is a log scale, so be careful. As we go up to around 200,000 routes in the routing table, the number of, if you will, instability events, the number of updates, is also kicking around close to that number and has been rising as the routing table rises. And the number of withdrawals has also been growing. So this is not a network that is well contained. It actually has different properties. The growth trajectory has slackened off, and the updates and withdrawals have slackened off largely because of that in the last 12 months, but it's still a different profile. The number of unstable prefixes is not constant, it's growing with the size of the routing table. So it's a different network. And for a long time, it was phenomenally unstable because of all these overlays of tunneling V6 over other things. That's really, really hard to keep, if you will, the network stable. And what we're finding now, of course, only recently is that stability appearing with a convergence time that's also around 50 odd seconds or so. So things are getting better, which is just as well. Instability, though, is interesting. If everyone was equally contributing updates, the profile would be along the green line. Every AS would contribute a fixed proportion of updates. What we actually find is, for example, in IPv6, just 2 ASs contributed half of the update load in the last 2 weeks of 2023. So what's actually going on is this instability. It's concentrated in a small number of almost pathologically unstable cases. In terms of futures, there was a period around 98 to 2000 when we thought we're all going to die a heat death of BGP. BGP was growing faster than Moore's law. Costs were rising. Oh my God, it was all disaster. Didn't happen. In general, BGP has been phenomenally well behaved. The drivers for growth are now basically disappearing. And because we're pushing content closer and closer to the edge of the network, and content distribution networks are key to the future of the internet over the coming years, that pushing to the edge has removed all the pressure on the middle. Much of the pressure on BGP is now slackened. We don't even need to use BGP for traffic engineering if all of your traffic is coming from down the road at a data center near you. And so because of that, much of the stress in the routing system has disappeared, and even the growth drivers have disappeared with it. However, there are still folk who get caught out. In Australia, in October last year, one of the major providers, Optus, managed to field routers where, as soon as you exceeded 1 million entries, it said max prefix limit, bring the session down, which was kind of a disaster because the session was the session to their offshore network control center. And so the control center no longer controlled the network, it was cut off because, 1 million entries, session shutdown. Optus. So there are probably others being caught in the same trap, because that's one of the defaults out there in equipment, that when you get to around 1 million, session shutdown appears to be the default behavior. You maybe should look at that, and if you do exceed max prefixes, you should set your router to freeze the routing table and keep on forwarding packets. Bringing down the session that caused that overload is perhaps the worst possible response. So know your limits in your network. Know how much memory you've got and how much fib capacity, and make sure that you're within safe limits of that. So yes, you're going to need a lot of memory, and it's the most expensive memory you can buy because on those line cards, this is fast memory. So now you're going to need about the same memory footprint for V6 as for V4. So look at that, review them, make sure you know them. And you don't need to carry all the routes all the time. Default is your friend, use it. And some vendors are now bringing out hot caching in their line cards because, quite frankly, no one uses all million entries. Once you've gone to Google, Netflix, YouTube, and a few others, that's it. Users don't go anywhere else. And if you had hot caching in your line cards and said, well, you've gone off to Poland or somewhere far away, that might take a bit longer. No one will really notice. And it will be a whole lot easier to keep your router operating within reasonable performance rates with hot caching in your line cards. So those kind of suggestions might help you in terms of looking at the next few years. So I've run through my time. Hopefully I'm within the time limit. Thank you very much for your attention. And with luck, I'm online able to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay, so the luck